Hey everyone. So this is chapter 5, uh, presenting data, which is essentially kind of the how to make a pretty map, actually. There's a lot of guidance as to the process of going beyond analyzing data, but actually creating a product at the end of it. So we're going to look at the basic principles of map design, which is sort of an iterative process. So it kind of goes around and around until like any other, like when you write a paper, the first one is never the right, the correct one. You're always revising, looking at selecting data, arranging it on the screen, and then on a map, how to symbolize things, and then obviously review and edit. And asking the question, am I done? Should I keep going? Then we'll also look at page layouts and scales, labeling and annotation, adding map elements, which is really easy, but it's a necessary. You have to have it on all maps. And then finally, briefly, how to print things out. Okay, so what are the basic principles of map design? Now, hopefully, you've all seen maps before. There's lots of maps all over the place, Google Maps. You see weather maps on the news, all kinds of maps. Somebody has to make the decisions as to what color schemes to use, how to place things on there, things like that. Okay, so here's a diagram, nice diagram that kind of shows you the process of how to make a map. And it all starts with the big blob in the middle called the objective. You always want to keep the map's objective in mind when creating the map. Every decision that you make in terms of the data selected, how to arrange it, symbolize, review, and edit, all must go back and fulfill what the objective of that particular map is. If I'm looking at seismic hazards in Southern California, and that's my objective, that automatically is going to create some decisions for me in terms of, well, I'm going to need the counties of California, Southern California. I'm going to need how to range things. Is it a north south, east west type of thing? How to symbolize with earthquakes and hazards. And there's sort of a default scale for that. So some of those decisions become very easy when you're trying to create these maps. So, like I said, the map objective is the most important part of the map. That's the part of the map you never want to lose sight of. So you have four key questions here. What is the purpose? Okay, so what is this map trying to tell? What story is this map trying to tell you? Is it seismic hazards? Is it where to place the next shopping mall? What is it? Who's your audience is the next one. Is it a scientific community? Is it at a town hall meeting where you just have a lot of people that may not necessarily be as technically inclined as you are? What's the medium? Is it up on a projector? Is it a printed map? And then under what conditions? We'll talk a bit about that as well. So there's different kinds of maps that serve different kinds of purposes, and you're gonna actually look some of these up as part of an exercise for chapter 5 in the review questions. Things like a location map. Well, Google Maps is a perfect example of that, right? Because you want to get from point A to point B. You have navigating maps. Again, point A to point B. Compiling maps, kind of showing somebody everything there is to know about a specific area based on a criteria, on an objective. Convincing maps. If I'm a new zoning administrator for a local city, who do I need to convince the taxpayers, let's say, to allow me to uh, buy up some land to place a new mall on, a strip mall, comparing sort of a before and after type of map. Um, this is used a lot for things like natural disasters, before an earthquake, after an earthquake, before a hurricane or tornado after. And then analyzing, which kind of goes into all of these, of course, you're doing various GIS selections and things like that in order to get your point across that much better. So, who's your audience for this particular map? Who's going to be viewing it? What's their expected level of knowledge? And I know this firsthand. If you've ever done tour groups for whatever reason, so I do tour groups at our little Gem and Mineral show, Gem and Mineral Museum, excuse me, at UWM. If they're fourth graders, I'm going to give a certain type of talk. And if they're high schoolers or even college students, I'll give a different talk because you have to kind of match the level of knowledge with who your audience is. I'm not going to give a super high tech, chemistry driven uh, tour to a bunch of fourth graders. All right? You'll lose them. They just care that they're shiny. All right. And then you have things like special requirements, color blindness, large print. And again, that goes back to, let's say if I'm displaying a map at a community center where you might have a lot of, let's say, um, retirees, elderly, older people who are interested in what you're talking about. So you might have to kind of keep that in mind. Is it a paper map? Is it going to be a report with several maps in paper, within built into the pages? Is it a wall map? Is it a poster? Is it electronic files? And that becomes an issue in terms of file sizes because even though we're as far advanced as we have with all this cloud storage, I can only still attach a 25 megabyte file to my email. So you have to keep those types of things in mind. In fact, these uh, voiceovers that I'm doing for this PDF, I have to put up on YouTube because Moodle, which I use at Alverno, it won't handle it. At MATC, you guys will see this up on Blackboard because I can't actually put them up there. So file size is always an issue. Computer screen, mobile is a huge thing. Will it scale down to a mobile phone? So, that type of thing. And not all applications do that really well, although they're getting a lot better. So you have to design for the medium. Paper maps are static and unchanging. If you look at the column on the left versus the right, they make the column on the left look like old and nobody uses that anymore. And that's not the case. Yes, you do still have to make paper maps because sometimes, especially out in the field, at least in my world in geology, you have to have maps. You can't always carry a computer with you, and if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you certainly aren't going to have anywhere to charge it. So you can still create very high resolution maps. Um, you can have multiple levels of information, so things like that. However, web maps are nice because they're interactive. You can sometimes download things on some. You can view, the viewing size may vary. One of the downsides is the poor sunlight on mobile devices, things like that you have to be aware of if you're in a sunny area. And then here's the unfortunate reality. Uh, Short attention span competes for attention. So we all know that. We all get distracted by Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is. So that's one of the downsides of having things up on the web. All right, so the first part of this process is to select the data. So keeping the overall objective in mind, we want to select the data first. How do we do that? Well, we've seen some ways of doing that, and you'll see more of those in Chapter 6. But you have to make choices as to what goes onto your map, selecting the data layers. Okay, who's the lead player, what layers are the selecting role. Now this isn't selection and necessarily always like where you just need New Jersey like you did in Chapter 2. This is more like when you have multiple layers on a map, do I need all of that on there, or am I going to garbage up my map? Now if you look at the map on the top right there, it's very busy and it's very hard to see what's going on. That's because the base map is overpowering the data that you're trying to get at. So if you take the one on the lower right, they took that base map and made it very transparent because it's only playing a minor role. It's sort of just there for looks to give it a little added, nuance, so to speak. But the real data, the real story are in those red dots, which are I believe those are septic systems. So the top one is way too busy, can't tell you what's going on. The bottom one is much better because the actual data now stands out as opposed to the background image, which is not the most important part. Should you omit some data? Now, this is another decision you have to make. You wouldn't think sometimes, but things like parcel owner names, sensitive information like pipelines, seismic station, climate stations, things like that, that could be at risk for vandalism, for example. I know seismic stations in my world in seismology, those are always being, ripped off, so to speak. It's a real issue in certain parts of the country. And then you have unintended consequences, things like showing faults underneath somebody's parcel. So if I'm at a community center and somebody says, "Hey, there's a fault that runs right under my house," if the insurance company sees that, their rates are going to go through the roof. Whereas the word fault doesn't necessarily mean anything that is actually going on. It's just a break in the rock record. That's its literal definition, but to an insurance company, they just hear the word fault and go, they see money. And they're like, your rates are going to go up, along with things like private water well tests. So, like in chapter 4, and then again, we'll do some more in chapter 6, you have to select within layers. You don't need to carry around any unnecessary data. Okay, so you're going to want to select by attribute, something called select by location, which we'll get to later, to whittle down the data to just what you need to tell your story. That's hugely important. You don't need all 50 states if you're only talking about Wisconsin. That makes no sense. So you're going to have, over time, that's one of the first, I call it pre-processing steps. You have to whittle down all your data to get to the point where all the data that you're going to need for your project is only of your area of interest, whatever that may be. So how do we do this? Well, we've already seen this a little bit with a query, of course. So if you look at the picture on the left there, it's quakes greater than 4.0. Well, in seismology, 4.0 earthquakes there's a lot of them, and they don't typically do a ton of damage, especially in this region, because there's always earthquakes. This is South America and Chile. All right. So if we change the selection to everything greater than 6, now you get a lot less clutter on your map, and you're looking at more earthquakes that could actually have potentially destructive characteristics. Okay. So these are from a financial and, human standpoint, these are probably more significant in terms of damage and everything going on, and it just looks cleaner on your map. So how do we do these kinds of things to whittle down the data? Well, there's some things called cartographic generalization. And I'm not going to go into these in gory detail, but there's simple different ways of doing this that you learn over time with different kinds of data, whether it be lines, points, or polygons, mostly lines and polygons. Not much you can really do with points. So you can refine them. So if you see over here, you see that this one over here in the upper, these are kind of complicated, right? They have all these little branches. Well, I can refine this, or same thing with this. This is very rugged here. Ooh, I grabbed the wrong tool, sorry. This is very rugged, where this is very simple. Now, it depends on what you're doing. If you need all of the detail from, let's say, this one here on, then by all means keep it. And I would say in most cases, at least for what I do, that's the more important one, is to keep the uh, all the little details. However, if you're looking at parcels and you just want to show that, let's say there's a river that runs in through that area, then the one on the simplified line here is probably no big deal. You could also, in the aggregate section here, you could take multiple of these and make it one big one. This is something used in what's called a dissolve tool, which makes life really helpful. You can collapse things, which I've never really done. I'll be honest with you. You also have reclassify up here in the upper left. And reclassify um, is hugely helpful for it's essentially renumbering or restructuring your data to highlight the ones you think are important. You're almost creating, in some cases, ordinal data where you go from all of these to sort of like a high ones, twos, and threes, or high, medium, and low. So these are things that you learn over time. You do these subconsciously. You don't even realize you're doing them. In fact, until I saw this slide when I started teaching, I'm like, oh, I'm doing most of this stuff anyway, and I didn't even realize it. Another important consideration when you're doing a project, and it should be one of the first decisions you make, is choosing a projection. Excuse me. Okay, because everything you do going forward is going to be based on that projection. If you look at the map, excuse me, the map on the left here, this is unprojected. So the entire country looks kind of squished and flattened because the program still thinks it's on a round ball as opposed to a flat screen. So you don't want to use this ever at all. So I'm going to put that in X. Nope, we want this. You don't want that one. You want this one. It's a smiley face. I'm sorry, I'm having too much fun with this now. All right, so that's kind of what we imagine the country to look like on our screen. So that's kind of what you always want to use. And I always tell my students, excuse me, I always tell my students, just use the projection that the bulk of your data is already in. It saves you time from projection, and there's other things you can utilize to help make sure that everything's in the same projection, which we talked about in Chapter 3. Things like exporting your data in the data frame or exporting the data into a geodata set, and then all the projections done for you. Now, there are times you still have to use the project tool, but this is a huge decision that you have to make right from the get-go to ensure all your data is pretty much in the same coordinate system and you're not trying to do any analysis in Latin long. All right, the next step we have in this process is the arranging step. Again, this make sure it always touches back to that objective. So we want to look at the visual hierarchy of our data, of our map, excuse me. Okay, now you've all seen this. You probably don't realize it, but you've all seen this. Most websites that you go to have this in mind. Okay, a, so you have an order. Websites have an order that they want you to look in usually kind of like top to bottom, left to right, sort of similar to reading a book, but it's not exactly like that. So we're going to look at this map here for a second. Okay, so if you look at this map, right away you should be able to see some things going on. Okay, you have a big map on the left. You have the legend on the right, and then a lower inset map. It's not a horrible map, but but what is it telling you right away? Hopefully you could see fairly quickly that okay, I understand where this map is relative to, let's say, the United States. You can see that with the inset map. You can also see with that, okay, they're using triangles of various sizes to show me something. Triangles, sizes, and then you see volcanoes. Oh, okay. So they're using the triangles to represent something that's somewhat triangular in real life, which makes sense, right? When you see, a volcano, it's sort of that triangle shape. So you're representing a natural phenomenon with a symbol that somewhat looks like it. That makes sense. That's what you should do. So what was the map about? Hopefully right away you could see that it was about volcanoes. What did you notice first? Well, I'm hoping you saw the really, really big map. Okay. How does your eye move around? Well, typically we're just trained to read left to right, top to bottom, right? And so hope that usually you could see that. So visualizing the hierarchy of your map, there's several things to consider as you do that. So things like the visual center, rule of thirds, balance, alignment, negative space. And you'll see that a lot of these are just common sense. I mean, you've seen them before. You may not know what they mean necessarily, but you've seen them. So alignment, things like using columns. Now, you've seen this a bazillion times because almost every website does this. I designed websites for several years. You use usually 2 to 3 columns in most cases. Okay, and you want to align your edges. Now, I will fully admit that that triggers my OCD if I see things that aren't aligned correctly. There are alignment tools that you can use when in layout view in GIS, so make sure you use those. All right. Negative space. Negative space is okay, but you have to balance it. Negative space just means blank areas, right? So if you look at the map on the top right, you have this funky little thing here. That's Alaska poking down. We don't care about Alaska. So if you look, America, when you look at it, this trends east to west like this. Okay. The problem is this is a portrait page going up and down, so it doesn't fit right. So the way we do um, you do that is if you have something that trends east and west across your screen, then you want to use a landscape image instead. See, now it goes all the way across like that. The other thing is that you can see that here is the you have the legend here, all of that, and it's all kind of bunched up. And is that horrible? No, it's not horrible. But the idea is in the bottom one, you're kind of separating things. You create sort of a modular effect with the legend being in here in this box here now. All right, and then the other elements. Now these are all required; they have to be there. But you can use negative space and things like that to help give let things breathe, but at the same time group things together that should be grouped together. So here's a couple of examples. California is A, big, and B, kind of a weird shape. So, there's a couple different ways you could do this. The one over here looks nice, and oddly enough, this space right here looks like Nevada. Um, so you can use the space, try to utilize it the best you can with what you're given. All right, so symbolization. Now we've talked about symbols a few times actually, but symbolizing is there decisions that have to be made, and you kind of end up making them again subconsciously, but you have to keep in mind obviously the objective, that's the overall, but again going back to your audience as well. So how do you get things to stand out without overpowering? You want to keep things in mind with balance, stuff like that. So on the excuse me, on the left here, we have different shades of color. You have outlines here. You have various thicknesses of going from thick to thin here. Pardon my horrible. I'm still getting used to learning how to do this. So you have various size triangles and then various size fonts. Now we've seen all this stuff before, but these are decisions that you have to make as you create a map. Okay. Once you get past the analysis part and you're starting to make it look pretty, so to speak, then you have to start making these decisions. All right. One of the things that if you have a lot of points, for example, when you look at these particular diagrams, um, you have to understand that you have to be able to point things out to people. You know what they mean, but how does everybody else know what they mean? And you do that either by, say, having one specific point in a color or a specific color, different size points like here, different shapes like here. Okay. Now this one's the one down here is a little weird because they're all the same color. Colors really do help. They can help quite a bit, and you want to use them as much as possible, but within reason, if that makes sense. So for example, this one over here, yes, there's three different colors, but do those three different colors tell you anything? That's a weird color scheme. So it all depends on what you're trying to get at. But the main thing you always want to keep in mind is if you didn't know anything about the information, would you be able to understand it? So here's another example of visual hierarchy. So the map up here on the top, what's wrong with that? There's a few things here. A, you have the grid that's on top of the map. Well, the grid isn't what's important, the map is. So you take the grid and you shove it to the back. Okay, that's just drawing order. You just drag it down to the bottom of your drawing order. And the other thing is while this is blue water, it's a very dark blue and it makes the map, it doesn't give the map the kind of contrast you're looking for. So the blue becomes sort of the dominant color when in fact the oceans aren't what you're trying to look at, it's the continents. So you make the ocean a much lighter blue and boom, the continents really pop then and allow you to sort of tell the story you're trying to get at. All right, review and edit. So here again, just like anything else, you have to review. Check your balance, look at it, have other people look at it. Spelling. This is huge. I print posters at UWM. This is huge. I always tell the story when we had our old plotter, that thing was horribly slow. It would take like 45 minutes to print one poster. Well, I had a whole bunch of posters to print, and I was doing a lot of swearing at the time. And I got this poster printed almost all the way out, and I went and looked down at it. Again, this is about 40 minutes into printing this thing, and the person had a typo in the title. This person also had already given it to me late. So now it's super late, and I had to reprint it. I was very upset. So check your spelling, check your grammar. Um, I tell people do all your word writing in Word and then just copy and paste it because Word is a word processor, ArcGIS is not. All right, so you want to pay attention to the little details, things like taking this here where there's no space and giving yourself some space. This doesn't is what the name of the file is, where this is what it should look like in English. Here, these are really weird numbers. Here, over here on the right, you have much more rounded numbers with the comma separators. Okay, so there's a lot of little details that need to go into how to do this stuff to make it human readable and professional looking. The one here on the legend here on the left is not professional. It was just thrown up there, and it doesn't, nobody thinks in terms of these weird numbers like this. So here's another map. So hopefully you can see right away there's all kinds of weird stuff going on here. You have Alaska dangling down here again. You have this really weird number. This is average. What is that? Average. I can't even see that. Sorry. Household size. But so there's a lot of weird things going on there. You have the name of the file there. You got a really bad color combination that doesn't show you anything. You have the rivers on there. I don't, and lakes. I have no idea what that has anything to do with household size. You have a really poorly formatted uh, um, map scale. There's a whole lot mess going on here. You don't need the lakes. You don't need the rivers. You got to change. And then you have all these extra zeros here. So this is what they changed it to. So this is much cleaner, obviously. Now, I will tell you that for the purposes of a course like mine, this map does not have a map scale or a north arrow. Um, can you get away with that? Sure. I always make it a requirement just so you get in the habit. So this should have a map scale and a north arrow on it. But being that it is the entire lower 48, you can kind of get an idea of the scale's not that big of a deal. And you already know that north is up. I get that. But I would mark you have dock points if you didn't have a map scale or a north arrow. But you can see they switched it to a landscape, going the long way here. They made changes to the color scheme. They shortened all the numbers. It's an overall much cleaner looking map. So, like I said, have others review your map. One of the things that I've learned since doing all this stuff, both printing posters and science in general, anything like that, have others look at it. It's huge. You may not like what they have to say. They may find grammar errors or typo errors, but it's better that they're found before you print them or show them to the public or whatever you're going to do with it. It just saves a lot of both. It might add a little time, but it'll save a little bit of embarrassment as well. So make sure you have other eyes look at this thing, because by the time you get to the point where you're printing a poster or making a map, you've looked at it for so long, you're kind of oblivious to any types of mistakes that might have been made. And then keep going, keep doing it. Simplify, try things, but always making sure that the objective is kept in mind. And then again, if you have to start over in the sense that you just go back through the process again and make sure that you understand that the objective is always being met, and then you can kind of either mentally or quickly go through this whole process again and again until you get it to the point where you want to, everything's working well. All right, so now we're going to kind of head into how to do this stuff in GIS itself. So we're going to look at page layouts and map scales. So map layouts are, hard copy maps or even what you see on your screen. And again, it's going to be portrait or landscape. You can add things like tables, graphs, images, or logos. You must have a title, a legend, scales, and north arrows. Those are required elements. But they're actually, other than the legend, they're pretty easy. They're very easy to add to an ARC map. So when you're in layout view and you're trying to make an actual map, you want to use the layout toolbar. And this is one of those things that's sort of a gotcha with a lot of new ArcGIS users. But for the most part, in all the years I've been actually doing GIS, I only really use the first four buttons on this particular toolbar. They're kind of similar to the tools on your main toolbar in that here the zoom in and zoom out tool, they don't zoom in or out to the data, they actually bring the paper closer to you. So if I had the sheet of paper in my hand, it would be closer to me by zooming in or out. Why would you use that? So when you're creating, let's say, a real big poster, it's hard to read fonts at certain sizes even though that they're there. So like a 12-point font will always print as a 12-point font, but you have to understand that you may not be able to read it on your screen, so you have to bring the paper closer to your eye. That's what those zoom tools are. Then you have the pan tool, just like in in data view. If you want to use the hand and move the map around with your hand, you can move the paper around with your hand as well. And then just like you have the full extent button, the little world button in data view, you have the fit to page button right here. So if you accidentally zoom in or out too far, you can click this fourth button here, um, and really it'll take you pretty much right to uh, where it'll zoom out to the page. That's one of the buttons you really want to know where it is and know how to use it. Well, I guess I just mentioned all this. So if you look at this is your main toolbar. This zooms in to the data. So here's all of Oregon here, and it actually zooms into the data. So you see the data closer. Whereas with the toolbar over here on the right, if you zoom in and out, that makes the page go in and out. Okay, so there's two different things here, and I guarantee you'll screw this up. I mean, everybody does. I still do it once in a while. I forget what toolbar I'm on, and it happens. The main thing is when you're in data view, use the world button to go back to sort of square one, and on the layout tool, you want to use this button, fit to page. That'll do the same sort of thing, and put the page right where you need it on your screen. So here's the steps to kind of laying out your map. So you need to plan the map, obviously. You kind of have an idea of what you might need, you might want to do. By the time you get to actually doing these steps, you've already done your analysis and you kind of know what you want it to look like. You just kind of have to make it happen. So then you have to set up the map page and the data frames. Well, if you're going to a poster session and they say, well, your poster can't be any bigger than 36 by 45, then you already know what size map you have, okay, or what size your layout is. Um, so that then you just make your map that big. Then after that, a lot of these are what I call one-click operations. So starting with adding a legend and going all the way down here, most of these are in the insert part of the program. If you go to the top of the program, it'll be insert data frame. Well, we've already seen that. That's where we can add another container. Insert a title, some text, insert a neat line, which I will get to in a bit. A legend, north arrow, scale bar, a picture way down here. These are super easy. They are exactly what they say they are. The only tricky one is the legend. That takes a little bit of practice. So you have to kind of understand, do I need portrait, landscape? How many data frames am I going to need? Sometimes that's an on the fly decision. It all depends on how best to tell the story, how to get that objective across. You want to make sure you have margins. You don't want to go right to the edge of any page, regardless of what it is. And you can use the grid in the background to help align things. Again, nothing shows a map as being unprofessional than things just blatantly unaligned. It's such a simple thing that makes a map look so much nicer. You can assign data frames names. That makes labeling and things like that a little bit easier. You could put label numbers on them. I've never ever done that, by the way. Just saying. You want to use the page and print setup. This is how you initially make the actual size of your map. So at UWM, my students have to make a map that is, or a poster, essentially that's 36 by 45. So you actually do that by unchecking this button here. You want to uncheck that button. And then once I have that, down here, you would make it landscape, and this would be 36, and this would be 45. Or would that be the other way around? It might be the other way around. But the point is you can see that this is where you put in the dimensions. If you don't uncheck this, it's going to use whatever is up here. Sometimes what happens is even if you uncheck this button, I typically have always made, if I need it in landscape, just put both of these buttons in landscape. It's just for whatever reason, sometimes this top one will override the bottom one, even though this button here is unchecked. So just make sure that everything is going on is down here on the bottom. This is what's going to control the size of your map. Once you have your frames on your page, you dictate how big they want to be, how small. Um, and I would suggest too that where they are on the page is up to you. You drag things around and move them. But sometimes it's really nice is actually keeping the numbers here. Sorry, that's a horrible circle. Keeping the numbers in these boxes even. So this one says 2.9039 inches by 3.69995. I would just make that 3 by 3.7, or if that's what you need. Round the numbers, because that way you know exactly how wide and tall everything are. So sometimes you want to duplicate that size. So let's say you have 4 that you want in a sort of a quad square thing, and you want them all the same size. That's how you do that. And this is just in the data frame properties. I right click on the data frame, I go to size and position tab, and you can tell it exactly how big you want that data frame. And it does help to keep those numbers round. So there's some units terminology that you're going to have to understand, and these aren't hard at all. There's the map units, which are determined by the data frame coordinate system. Okay. If you remember that one of the rules of GIS is whatever data I put on in the data frame first, that data frame now has that coordinate system. So if that coordinate system is in meters, my map units will be in meters, and if my units are in feet, my map units will be in feet. You can't change that unless you create a new map and start over. You could also have the display units. This is the units that are displayed as you move your mouse around. Okay, it'll be in whatever the map units are, but you also have the ability to change that. It's just a visual thing. So even though my map might be in meters, the numbers that are down in the lower right corner of my screen are really weird and don't make sense. I can change that to Latin lawn just to make my life easier so I get a better frame of reference as to where my mouse actually is. And then you have the page units, which, let's say if you're using an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, are 8.5 by 11. So here is up here on the top, this is your map scale. That's your scale bar. The units are, you'll see this, are grayed out. So this is grayed out because that's what the data is in currently. You can't change it unless if you use the project tool. So right now it's in meters, and as I move my mouse around, you'll see this is in meters as well, the bottom one, and down here in the lower right corner, this is in meters. I have the ability though to change this particular drop down menu, and I can make that meters, kilometers, miles, Latin lawn, all kinds of things. So here I go to, that's in the data frame properties. I right click, go to my data frame, go to the general tab, and right here I use this drop down menu, and I can change it to, let's say, degrees, minutes, seconds, and now I have degrees, minutes, seconds in my as I move my mouse around. Again, why is that? Why would that you do that? If I'm trying to pick off the Latin line of, let's say, some wells I have, things like that, it's a good way to get a location for them. And just in general, it's very hard to understand what these are visually. I don't know what that means, but I do know what the Latin line in the lower right corner means, um, at least a little bit easier. Labeling and annotation, you got to have labels. It's one of the more, I always say we have to talk about labels, even though it's like watching paint dry. But it isn't, you have to have some labels on your map. And we'll talk about annotation in a second. All right, so there's three kinds of labels that you can use for um, your map. There's dynamic labels, which we talked about in chapter 2. That's basically just allowing the program to set the labels for you and just kind of let them go wherever they may. You can use graphic text, which is where you kind of manually add a label here or add a label there. Um, and those are perfectly fine depending on how many you need. If you don't have a lot of labels, graphic text is no big deal. And then you have what are called annotation, which are built from dynamic labels. And the beauty of those is that you can save them to reuse them, and you can place them exactly where you want them. I use them quite a bit because in my case, most of my maps don't have a lot of labels, and this allows me to drag them right to where I want them. So like in chapter 2, you have dynamic labels. You turn on the checkbox, you right click properties, go to the labels tab, and you check the little box here. Okay, so that's the box that turns them on. Then you have to set this to the column in your attribute table that you're going to turn the labels on for. Typically, we use, if you remember, nominal data. Yes, that's right, nominal data. And then you just have all these options here as to what you want them to look like. And we've already gone into that. I'm not going to talk about that now. Okay, so that's dynamic labels. We've already talked about that. Graphic text, there's some options. Now this dot right here is in the draw toolbar. The draw toolbar is here down on the bottom, okay? And you'll see this tiny little A. And don't forget there's a little drop down menu right there. That little tiny triangle is a drop down menu, okay? And that's where all of these are underneath here. So if you just click on the A, you'll get text. But if you click on the drop down menu, you'll see all the other ones. Now you'll notice this label one here is grayed out. The label tool, which is in the tutorial, um, is only allowed to be used in data view. So if you're in layout view like that, it'll be grayed out. But anyway, you'll see that later. You could do things like spline text, which you guys did a while back. Um, you you could do call outs, you know, these little cartoony looking things. You could do polygon text, rectangle text, circle text. That's getting really fancy. It's not that big of a deal. Spline text allows you to like do this type of thing where it goes along a river. It'll actually, as you type, it'll just kind of follow the river. It's kind of fun. Okay, so there's different options. And if you only have a couple labels that you need, this is by far probably the easiest way to do it. You can do multi-line labels. Think of captions, right? If you have a figure with a caption, um, what I will tell you though is that GIS is not a word processor. This is one of those things that drives me nuts. So if you look at, if I add some text on here and I go to the properties of that text, I can just double click on it. You'll notice here's the text, right? Here's all the text that I have. But if you see this here, you can't change that. So let's say I wanted font Arial 12 or Times New Roman 12. I can't change it here. I have to go back to the draw toolbar and change the font or font size there. I can change the justifications here, okay? But it's an annoyance. Again, this is not a word processing program, it's a GIS program. So what I tell students is when you get to the point where you're adding text to a poster or a map, do all of that in Word and then copy and paste it into a polygon text or excuse me, let me take that back. I apologize. Not polygon text, rectangle text. So in order to make this box here, you need rectangle text. Okay? So that's how you do that. And then you can just copy and paste it like a word processor. But make sure your spelling and everything is correct as well. That's easier done in Word than in GIS. You also can use the label tool, which I never use admittedly. Um, this is the label tool that you used previously. Uh, this is the one here that you're going to use for those of you doing the tutorial. You can literally click and the label will pop up. I never use it. Not something I do, but it's there. And everybody always forgets you got to click on this tiny little drop, that little triangle there in order to get at it. In data view. Must be in data view. Now annotation is another form of labeling that's created from dynamic labels. So you have to turn on the labels originally uh, from the properties menu. You turn on the click the checkbox, get them where you want them, and then you can actually you right click on the data frame and you can save them. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to have full control over each and every label. And depending on how you save them, you can reuse them. You can have others edit them, which is beyond what we do. Um, so you can, there's two different ways to show them. You could do it as text in a map document, which we're going to do, or you can have them as a feature class in a geodatabase. Now, that if you're going to reuse labels a lot for various maps, like in a templating situation, this second option is really good. However, you have to have editor in order to edit them, okay? Which is, you have just an added step, but it's still doable. For the most part, you're going to use this top option here. It's just a lot easier. So when you first put the labels on your map, okay, you are labeling them at whatever scale the map is at, okay, and they stay that way regardless of whether you zoom in or out. However, if you put on what's called the reference scale, that's the, here you'll see it's the scale at which symbols appear at their assigned size. Now this is not that big of a deal. especially for paper maps, because if you're printing a poster, this means nothing. But on a web map, as you zoom in or out, if if I set the scale at, let's say, 1 to 24,000 with 10 point font, the only time my points will be at 10 point font, or my labels, excuse me, the only time my labels will be at 10 point font is at 1 to 24,000. So if I zoom in, they get bigger. If I zoom out, they get smaller. And so they only appear at the correct size if they're at the correct scale. So how do you prepare annotation? Well, it's not that big of a deal. You zoom to the scale, you turn on the labels first of all. So you set up and turn on the labels, and then the big thing with annotation is you want to make sure you turn off any labels you do not want converted, because when you go to convert it to annotation, it converts any labels that are on. So therefore, you want to just turn on the ones you need, let's say cities or counties or whatever, and then you right click on your layer, your data frame layer here, and go to convert to layers, or excuse me, convert to annotation. So then you're going to get two options. You're going to get two radio buttons: store in a geodatabase or store in a map. And you almost always want to use this one. So right now, down here, it tells you which labels are currently turned on and which ones are going to be converted to annotation, and what that annotation group is going to be called. They add the word anno afterwards, if you didn't notice that. Okay, so right now the capitals layer labels are turned on, and so are the major cities labels. So those are going to be converted to annotation. Once you convert them to annotation, if there's conflicts as to where the program doesn't know what to do with them in terms of overlap and things like that, you'll get this pop-up box here. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. Some people get it, some people don't. Then you just got to figure out what you're going to do with it. Are you going to place them and then move them around, or just delete them altogether? You have the option. Okay. Then you could create annotation groups for different various types of annotation. Again, that's a bit more complicated than what we need to worry about, so I'm not going to worry about it right now. Finally, we got to add the map elements, the required map elements, and then some optional ones as well. So adding a legend is by far one of the more trying things when you first learn how to do it. It takes practice. Now, there's a couple of different ways to do this, and the way I've always done it is I just get the legend on my map. I just basically, it's a wizard driven system. So when you go to add a legend, you just kind of click through the wizard to get it up onto your screen. So I typically just get what I need into my legend and then just get it on my screen, and then I edit it, rather than trying to make it perfect within the wizard itself. And I'll explain that as we go. So here's the legend wizard. So here's all of the layers on my map currently, and then these are the ones I want actually on my legend. And you can control that with these buttons here. You can take them from left to right, and then I click the next button. So the next button takes me to the legend title. Don't change that. You don't need to change it. It is a legend. Just keep the name as legend. I never change that. Now, these next steps, I will tell you, are the ones I mentioned earlier, where I just kind of go through them and just click, 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 click. I get it on my screen, and then I edit from there. Okay, that's just me personally. Some of the other things that you'll see in the Legend Wizard is adding a legend frame, which I typically suggest doing. You should have a border around your legend. You can create what are called patches. So if I have, let's say, lakes, you can see it right here. Here's water bodies. So these yellow uh, polygons here. These are called patches. That's what you're going to see in the legend. If you add a water body, it's going to give you this little watery looking uh, polygon, which, again, it adds a little bit of nicety to your map, and it makes it look a little bit more professional. All of these control where all of the the distances between elements on your map. So if you want this gap here, you have to figure out which one of these this is. And I always forget which one it is. I'm not gonna guess. I think it's this one here, but I'm not gonna exactly sure. Um, so you have to figure out which one is which. And again, you can do this after it's already on your screen. So once you have it on your screen, you have to choose. You also have to choose a style. Now this is where it gets a bit confusing, especially when you're first learning how to do this. So there's different styles. You have, like for example, the patch. You have a label, and then you have the symbol. So that's what it's going to look like. You have the patch and the label with no symbol. Excuse me, label only. Now there's all different kinds of these types of symbols. And this one has the word geology on it. This one has the word geology and sort of a subheading underneath it. So it all depends on what you need for your particular legend. And, and you can get that through changing this, going back into the properties. Uh, you just double click on the legend itself, and you can change if you go to the items tab down here at the style button. Here's all those styles that I just showed you right here. There's a whole bunch of them. And if you click on one of them, it'll give you a preview as to what it's going to look like over here. All right. So yeah, it takes practice. Making a legend takes practice. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is that there's a one-to-one correlation between your table of contents and your legend. So here's my table of contents. So here's my layer. Here's my that I would use in GIS. Whatever is in here is exactly what's going to be over here. Okay, so if I type the word geology, that's where this word geology comes over here. If I type in rock unit here, that's where the word rock unit. That's why it's imperative to make sure that everything on the left is in English. You don't want like geology.shp. You want to get rid of all that. You want to label things nicely in English so that whoever's using your map can understand your legend correctly. So some of the other required elements are really easy to add to your map. It's just a matter of going up to the Insert tab on the program and going down. So you have North Arrow, Scale Bar, and Legend. These are what I call one-click operations. So for the the Scale Bar, if I click on Scale Bar, you get this particular screen here. You literally just pick your favorite one, double-click on it. There's lots of options for the Scale Bar. Me personally, I almost always use this one, the alternating number 1, and then I change both of these here to 2. So right now you have down here in this diagram, you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 subdivisions, and then there's one full division, the second 3, 4. So let me get rid of that. So there's 4 main divisions. That's where these two numbers come from. So I usually put mine 2 and 2, and it just makes it nice and even. You could. The other thing is then once you have it on your screen, you just drag the left or right edge in or out and get it to numbers that are nice and neat. Nothing's more annoying than having some weird number like 0.0762 on a scale bar. Make sure their numbers are nice and neat and human readable. That's pretty much it for a scale bar. You just put it on there, drag it to round numbers, and change divisions and subdivisions if you want. That's personal preference. I'm not going to go into these. These are if you do the tutorial, it'll be in there. I never mess with these. You can really get in detail with this, but go ahead and play around them. It's not that big of a deal. Adding a north arrow is even easier. You go to the insert tab in the program, click on north arrow. You get this big list of north arrows. You choose your favorite, double click on the one you want. I almost always use this one. I just like that one. It puts it over here. You can change the color of it. You can change the size of it. What you don't want to do is mess with the calibration or the angle. You don't want to do that. That's for specific purposes, especially when you're dealing with polar regions. You don't want to mess with that at all. So that's pretty much it for north arrows. You just double click the one you like and put it on your screen and drag it to where you need it. You can create frame grids. Again, this is only applicable typically if you're mapping real large areas like all of the US here in Alaska. That might be a thing, but if I'm just in one county in Wisconsin, probably don't need this. There's a wizard for adding grids and graticules. You can do that in the tutorial. It's just, again, it's not something you're going to use a whole lot. You can add texts and titles. Um, Again, all that means is the title. If I double click on title, it's just going to automatically make it bigger. You can see it's 20-point font. You can still make that bigger. That's still not going to be large enough for most maps. Um, you playing with the text and everything. It just you combine that with the draw toolbar. Make sure you have the draw toolbar open so you can make text bigger or smaller. You can add pictures. In fact, I encourage adding pictures. Pictures add a sense of place. Just having a map is not always it's good, but it's good to have something that's associated with it. For example, this is the Boston Harbor, so they have a picture of a ship here. Now, what they do, if you look on the next image here, is they add a border. What these are called neat lines. Now, you'll see it here. It's in the insert bar. Neat lines are just borders. Now, why are they important? They're kind of like, if you were looking at a sentence, they're kind of like a period on a sentence. To the person looking at the poster, it's sort of a stopping and ending point in terms of where to look, stop looking, and where to go to the next portion. So I really like neat lines. I like having my things modular in boxes like that. And then what they did is they added a background color that just so happens to look like water to make this over here without to make it look like the ocean is there, even though it's just a background color. So it's a little trick they use because in the previous slide that was just white. So they used a background color to make it look blue and save themselves from actually having to put data there to make the ocean blue. Neat little trick. You can add graphics if you need them, depending on what you're doing. Again, it's not always applicable. And then finally, you want to review and print. Again, have other people look at it. You know, just make sure you have as many eyes on it. You'd be surprised how many times people say, "Oh, that's not aligned," or "That's misspelled," or "Your grammar in there is wrong," or whatever. Have other people look at it as well. And we already saw this. Make sure that you have all of your this is unchecked, so you're actually using the page that size that you need if it's in landscape, and then you go from there. You print it out. You can also export it as various file types, such as a PDF, which is very handy. One of the things that in my GIS class at UWM is I have everybody export them as a PDF, and then they present them at the end of the semester. The one weird thing is every once in a while you'll get an artifact, something that won't convert correctly. They've fixed a lot of that, but sometimes you'll still get that every once in a while, where when you convert it to a PDF, a north arrow will get all wonky or something like that. So that's it. That's chapter 5, basically how to make a pretty map. So I appreciate you following along, and we'll see you in chapter 6.